Since the time of Socrates, philosophy has always been associated with, or even synonymous with, the dialectic. Two minds, meeting in dialogue, and through their attempts at negating one another's arguments, through their opposition, they come closer to the recognition of the truth. This is the promise of the dialectic, and this method has been followed throughout the history of Western philosophy. And there's a sense in which we could see that whole history as one long intergenerational dialogue between minds. Among Western philosophers, perhaps none is more strongly associated with the dialectic than Hegel. He takes this idea of the dialectic beyond the notion of a literal dialogue, but imagines instead dialogue on a grand scale. He interprets philosophy as a long series of opposing conceptions, meeting and clashing, experiencing one another as negations, and then through this negation of the other, mutual recognition of the other. And this process doesn't just play out in philosophy, but in history. And this is exemplified in Hegel's master-slave dialectic. In the master-slave dialectic, Hegel asserts that the progression and development of human consciousness is mediated through this power relationship. All human beings, Hegel argues, are struggling to make manifest their self-identity and do this by opposing themselves to what is external, what is other. And in this clash between self and other, one human being dominates and the other is dominated. And what they both discover in the long course of the development and progression of the social hierarchy is that neither is satisfied with this outcome, for what both truly want is mutual recognition, for their self to be recognized as a self by the other, to know that I am an individual, that I'm free, that I exist through your recognition that I am an individual, that I am free, and that I exist, and thus I do the same for you and recognize this about you as well. And so for Hegel, history proceeds toward this end, this goal of mutual recognition. In the Hegelian story of history, there is a meaning to human life. There is an intelligible tale to be told about existence. Hegel's devout Christianity doesn't conflict with his philosophical conclusions. In fact, his conclusions are rather openly in accord with his Christianity. Hegel seeks to unify being and becoming by interposing a story of being, interposing an absolute upon this world in which everything is apparently impermanent and meaningless. Hegel's absolute is the transcendent as revealed in appearance, in the same way that God appears on earth as a flesh and blood man. There have been opponents of Hegel ever since his philosophy came into existence, but Hegelians are particularly difficult opponents to argue with, because they can always play the card that anyone who opposes the dialectic by that very act enters into a dialectical relationship with it. That, in fact, by setting oneself up as the opposite of Hegel, one does not escape from the truths of Hegelianism, but actually reinforces them. That a negative relationship between two philosophical positions and the quest for recognition that both positions have actually points to this essential dialectical relationship between ideas. The Hegelian position is that to be in opposition is to be in a state of relatedness. Anyone who opposes Hegel is related to Hegel. They have to make reference to Hegel in order to oppose Hegel, and that means their argument is dependent on Hegel. Therefore, from the Hegelian standpoint, maybe you could try to argue against Hegel, but you can't ultimately argue against the dialectic. Nevertheless, this is exactly how French philosopher Gilles Deleuze characterizes his philosophy, as anti-Hegelianism, and a form of anti-Hegelianism that he argues is not dialectical, and he positions himself as being against the dialectic. Deleuze lived from 1925 to 1995. His legacy is that of one of the most influential postmodern philosophers. He's perhaps best known for his works co-written with the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari and his metaphysics based on difference. For Deleuze, Hegel's errors are responsible for enduring confusion in metaphysics. He found many figures from the past to draw upon, which Deleuze describes as natural opponents of Hegel. Deleuze reads Spinoza in this way. We might also look to Hegel's contemporary Arthur Schopenhauer. But for Deleuze, the definitive opponent of Hegelianism is not Spinoza or Schopenhauer. It is, in fact, Friedrich Nietzsche. Such an assessment might invite immediate criticism, since Deleuze considers himself an opponent of Hegel. His metaphysics is an anti-Hegelian metaphysics, and so it's very likely to be charged that maybe he's projecting his anti-Hegelianism where it doesn't exist. I want to set that kind of critique aside for the time being, since I think the best way to evaluate whether that criticism is valid is to consider it in light of Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche and whether we find it plausible. So that's what we're going to do. Deleuze also says he's solely concerned with metaphysics. But what he means by this is that he's solely concerned with the questions of a first philosophy, that which is prior to physics, we might say, the questions of ontology, as to what reality itself is. This is another kind of claim that might invite immediate criticism from, in this case, Nietzscheans. But it's another critique that I'd like to put to one side for the time being, because it has to do more with how Deleuze understands his role or his project. And in some sense, what I think Deleuze is trying to get at with positioning himself this way is that he's doing philosophy, or attempting to do philosophy in its unadulterated form, philosophy entirely as an examination of knowledge, entirely as a method and operation of knowledge. I think that Nietzsche would have seen his project rather differently, but nevertheless, we could say in favor of Deleuze that he's not doing metaphysics in the sense of trying to discover the thing in itself, the world as such. That is all quite far from Deleuze's purposes, and I think that'll become clear as we get into this book. Another aspect of Deleuze that may raise eyebrows for some is that he's broadly categorized as a man of the left, I think fairly. But it must be understood, Deleuzian postmodernists established their philosophy on the basis of Nietzsche's work, which places them in contrast, and as we've said, opposition to the Marxist dialecticians who are ultimately descendants of Hegel. And we should note, even within this construction and this analogy of Deleuze as descending from Nietzsche, so to speak, and the modern Marxist as descending from Hegel, Deleuze would say that such an approach to philosophy is in contrast with the dialectic, because we are thinking not dialectically, but genealogically, and perhaps not even consciously so. Deleuze argues that the concept of genealogy is one of Nietzsche's great contributions to philosophy, and the Deleuzian view of how genealogical thought works is that it's part and parcel with this understanding of metaphysics that is pluralistic, a multiplicity which is not defined by an essential relationship to another, but each of which is quote-unquote its own thing. Every force is individual, every phenomena is particular. Deleuze will say that in Nietzsche, he finds this same kind of attitude toward reality, what Deleuze would call an existence characterized not by opposition, but by difference. Deleuze's most famous work, Difference and Repetition, puts forward this metaphysics of difference. But today, we're going to look at a book that's much more relevant to our podcast, which is Deleuze's Nietzsche and Philosophy. Now, an obvious observation is that Nietzsche mentions Hegel little, if at all, in his work. But the argument would be, from the Deleuzian perspective, that Nietzsche is demonstrating performatively what he asserts philosophically, that difference is not opposition, and so, accordingly, he spends no time opposing Hegel in his published works. Hegel gets more attention in Nietzsche's unpublished notes, but even there, the references are sketchy and his direct critical thoughts are largely inchoate. But as I've argued in the past, you could think about it this way. Just as Nietzsche said later of his first book, Birth of Tragedy, that there was a silent hostility to Christianity throughout, The entirety of the book is antagonistic to Christianity, but this point is never stated outright in any one sentence of the work. So too, Deleuze finds this same sort of silent hostility against Hegel throughout Nietzsche's entire philosophical corpus. I'm going to read from Nietzsche and Philosophy, section 4 of the first chapter of the work, in an abridged form. Quote, "Not all relations between same and other are sufficient to form a dialectic, even essential ones. Everything depends on the role of the negative in this relation. Nietzsche emphasizes the fact that force has another force as its object. But it is important to see that forces enter into relations with other forces. Life struggles with another kind of life. Pluralism sometimes appears to be dialectical, but it is its most ferocious enemy, its only profound enemy. This is why we must take seriously the resolutely anti-dialectical character of Nietzsche's arguments. If we do not discover its target, the whole of Nietzsche's philosophy remains abstract and barely comprehensible. The question against whom itself calls for several replies. Anti-Hegelianism runs through Nietzsche's work as its cutting edge. We can already feel it in the theory of forces. In Nietzsche, the essential relation of one force to another is never conceived of as a negative element in the essence. In its relation with the other, the force which makes itself obeyed does not deny the other, or that which it is not. It affirms its own difference and enjoys this difference. The negative is not present in the essence as that from which the force draws its activity. On the contrary, it is a result of activity, of the existence of an active force and the affirmation of its difference." End quote. The key point here is that such a negative relationship might well exist between forces, but this is not primary. It's not what establishes the essence or character of the forces themselves. What is primary is the forces themselves in all their particularity, in all their difference. This is difference as an affirmation. One affirms what one is, which is inseparable, Deleuze will later say, from what one does, and this affirmation is what Nietzsche characterized as a noble mindset. As Nietzsche writes, the noble soul has reverence for itself. It feels in itself the right to make judgments, to act in the world in accord with its own desires or nature, to give rise to that which is like myself, in the form of offspring or by spreading one's ideas, or the capture of hearts through art and music. It's not the desire to create that which is exactly the same as myself. Rather, all such repetitions are themselves based on difference. And this is fine, and in fact, it's more than fine, because contained within that affirmation of oneself is the affirmation of the difference of oneself from the other, and the enjoyment of this. That there is a natural happiness in this sense of affirming difference. The artistic, the creative, the noble way of life is precisely to affirm oneself in one's difference. Affirmation, what Nietzsche called saying yes, is the primary act, whereas Hegelianism presupposes the negation as the primary act, the negation as a means of establishing an affirmation. One has to negate first in order to even get around to asserting anything which could be affirmed. In fact, there's no truly affirmative act of difference in the Hegelian metaphysics, since everything is dependent. All that exists within a relation upon which its being is established. Nothing is truly separate from anything else in the Hegelian view. Nietzsche tells us in Beyond Good and Evil, in his rebuke to the Stoics, that life strives to be different, to be arbitrary. We get the sense throughout Nietzsche's writing that nature is this multiplicity in which every force, every type of organism wants to be unique and is thus unjust or judgmental in its uniqueness. To judge is to be unjust, Nietzsche argues. To be different is to be arbitrary. Nietzsche writes in the final chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, What is Noble, that life is essentially appropriative, domineering, exploitative, tyrannical. But all of this springs not from a desire to negate the other, but from an initial affirmation, an active, aggressive, self-willed mode of being, defined by, quote, the pleasure of knowing oneself different, end quote. And so there is a good justification or a good foundation in Nietzsche so far for the argument that Deleuze is making. Deleuze writes, quote, Nietzsche's yes is opposed to the dialectical no, affirmation to dialectical negation, difference to dialectical contradiction, joy, enjoyment to dialectical labor, lightness, dance to dialectical responsibilities. The empirical feeling of difference, in short, hierarchy, is the essential motor of this concept, deeper and more effective than all thought about contradiction. Furthermore, we must ask, what does this will which wills the dialectic want? It is an exhausted force which does not have the strength to affirm its difference, a force which no longer acts, but rather reacts to the forces which dominate it. Only such a force brings to the foreground the negative element in its relation to the other. End quote. And Deleuze then quotes Nietzsche from the Genealogy of Morals, Part 1, Section 10, quote, while every noble morality develops from a triumphant affirmation of itself, slave morality from the outset says no to what is outside, what is different, what is not itself, and this no is its creative deed. End quote. Deleuze then frames Nietzsche's argument, as put forward in that work, Genealogy of Morality, as a clear and direct rebuke to Hegel's master and slave dialectic. For Nietzsche, the master and slave morality do not represent a dialectical relationship wherein both the master and slave are ultimately striving for the same thing or essentially dependent on one another for their self-identity. For Nietzsche, the master and slave are different. They're not dialectically related. They're historically rooted psychological orientations toward the world produced by a different genealogy. Deleuze sees the significance of genealogy as accounting for the origin of values. Genealogy is the study of the differential element in the origin of values, by which different lineages of values are produced. And this is what is missing from the Hegelian account, the differential question of value. Deleuze will say that Nietzsche himself introduces the concept of value into philosophy. Actually, the first sentence of the book is that, I'm paraphrasing here, but one of the great contributions of Nietzsche is to introduce sense and value into philosophy. The way Deleuze will talk about sense is by the proposition that things have the sense that they do owing to your perspective, owing to who and what you are. And the way that this relates to values is that Deleuze will say we always possess the values that we deserve owing to who and what we are. When Deleuze is talking about the sense of something, what he means is that a force will seize upon a particular data point and give it the sense that it has for that particular force according to the perspective of that force. Perhaps the easiest paraphrase of this in plain English is the way that Nietzsche says there are no moral facts, only interpretations of facts. And when Deleuze uses the language of seizing upon the world, right, trying to grab hold of part of it and giving it the sense that we have, investing it with the interpretation that we have, it's worth noting that the etymology of the term perception or perceive comes from the Latin for to seize, to grab hold of. That's what we do when we perceive the world. Our senses grab hold of some aspect of it, and it has the sense that it has for us based on who and what we are, and our values then flow out of that. These differing kinds of valuations about the world and human life therefore have a true distance between them based on your vantage point, and there's not any Hegelian thread that ties or binds them together, these different types of valuing. Deleuze continues in the same passage that we've been reading from, quote, the relation of master and slave is not in itself dialectical. Who is the dialectician? Who dialectizes the relationship? It is the slave's perspective, the way of thinking belonging to the slave's perspective. The famous dialectical aspect of the master-slave relationship depends on the fact that power is conceived of not as will to power, but as representation of power, representation of superiority, recognition by the one of the superiority of the other. What the wills in Hegel want is to have their power recognized, to represent their power. The slave only conceives of power as an object of recognition, the content of a representation, the stake in a competition, and therefore makes it depend, at the end of a fight, on a simple attribution of established values. The portrait of the master that Hegel offers us is, from the start, a portrait which represents the slave, at least as he is in his dreams, as at best a successful slave. Underneath the Hegelian image of the master, we always find the slave." End quote. The question, which one, or who is, as in, which one would argue this, or who is speaking here? These are the definitive questions for Nietzsche as Deleuze sees it. Whereas the dialectician asks, what is, as in, what is reality? Nietzsche asks, who is the type of person who produces this representation of reality? One example that Nietzsche touches on in his work, we might ask the question, who is speaking here in regard to Immanuel Kant? Who is the kind of man who authors the Critique of Pure Reason? Well, we find that he's a man with a rigid schedule. We find he's a man who was haunted his whole life by hypochondria, by anxiety and depression. What was his style when writing philosophy? What were his aims? Well, Nietzsche argues in Beyond Good and Evil that Kant, with his tables and categories, stood before the history of German philosophy and declared, "This is the most difficult thing ever to be undertaken in the history of metaphysics." Which of these aspects would be relevant in trying to understand Kant? Well, you could make the argument that all of it is relevant. These are all aspects of Kant the person which help us contextualize and understand his philosophical productions. These are the questions that concern us when we ask, who is, or which one? We ask where the perspective is coming from and what's it based on. And you can kind of get at that by asking questions about who they were in terms of how they actually acted in their lives, what their position in society was, what their psychology was, even aspects of their writing style and how they approached philosophy. Deleuze, in his other work, would later pioneer something he called rhizomatic analysis, or schizoanalysis. This is from his work with the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari. In their estimation, most philosophy is structured in an arboreal form, in the manner in which a tree grows. A tree grows upwards. It branches off from one central trunk into multiple branches, right? Deleuze and Guattari use the rhizome as an example of a form of plant life that grows in a manner unlike a tree. The rhizome is an example of growth with no central structure. There's no trunk, no central locus from which everything branches outward. In rhizomatic analysis, every point is connected with every other point. The center is multiple, we might say, ever-shifting, unpredictable. And so, to approach a philosopher in a rhizomatic way would be to analyze them on every conceivable level without the prejudice that any one point is the center. Their ideas, their personal life, even their physiological illnesses and conditions, and the poetry they wrote, and their letters, all of this can be part of an image of the subject's thought, which reflects the irrational chaos of the human being, without trying to superimpose one's own narrative or structure onto them. Deleuze's rhizomatic analysis is therefore an application, I would say, of Nietzsche's perspectivist approach. And this is the difference between pluralism and dialectics. It's why pluralism is the most ferocious opponent of dialectics. Nietzsche's perspectivism is inevitably pluralistic and genealogical, and that's why it stands against the dialectic. The dialectic itself here is recognized as the mode of philosophy utilized by the reactive person. The kind of person whose existence is dependent is the kind of person who sees all being as dependent. The kind of person who says no to life is the kind of person who sees all being as established by negation. Deleuze details how Nietzsche's views developed, starting with Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy. In this book, Nietzsche contrasts Apollo and Dionysus, the two great artistic deities of the ancient Greeks. They're placed into a sort of relationship in which, by the combination of both, the Greeks aesthetically redeem or justify existence. And we've talked about this extensively in the podcast. We did a whole book analysis of The Birth of Tragedy, so it's very complicated to explain what's in that book, but the material's there. If you haven't heard it, go back and listen to that. Some have accused Nietzsche of establishing a dialectic in this book, when it comes to these two figures. Apollo is the shining one, the god of the plastic arts, the god of visions and dreams. He's a god of virtue, distance, sacred boundaries. In effect, Apollo is an art force for individuation, for civilization and its illusions. Dionysus is the god of ritual madness and intoxication, and the Dionysian exists in the Dionysian music, the dithyrambs, and these rituals of self-forgetting. Through Dionysus, the ego consciousness, rather than being reified, as by the dream power of Apollo, is instead shattered. The individual loses himself in drunkenness and dance. The Greeks combine these two art forces and create Greek tragedy. And in this drama, Nietzsche sees an example of how life could be justified. Both Apollo and Dionysus stand for opposite things: self-creation versus self-destruction, self versus no self. And yet somehow they resolve or synthesize and create Greek tragedy. The meaning of Greek tragedy is the dismemberment and death of Dionysus, who is the original tragic hero, and his eventual rebirth, signifying the cyclical rhythms of life. And so the loss of self, which eventually comes to all due to the mortality of human beings, is given an image. It's the breaking of all representations, an act which is nevertheless represented. Deleuze argues that Nietzsche himself recognized the ways in which the dialectic may have unduly influenced him, and eventually Nietzsche moved on from this type of approach as his thought matured. After all, Nietzsche later wrote that The Birth of Tragedy smells offensively Hegelian. But Deleuze suggests that this is not the deepest problem with Birth of Tragedy, and that the critique of the Apollo and Dionysus duality as closet Hegelianism is somewhat superficial for a number of reasons. Dionysus and Apollo don't enter into a unity from the result of the negation of one another. Rather, they affirm themselves in their difference through the same art form. The difference between the two is never resolved or synthesized. As Deleuze points out, Nietzsche even says, it's not an equal reconciliation. Dionysus ultimately is the victor. He is the dominant artistic force. While the argument for this, as given in Birth of Tragedy, is rather complex, the short version is that the content of Greek tragedy is ultimately Dionysian, even if the tools used to achieve it borrowed from the Apollinian. There's no resolution in which both equally recognizes the other. The Dionysian is the dominant force, and this doesn't come in the form of the negation of Apollo by Dionysus. Apollo is different from Dionysus, and both of them continue to enjoy this difference, we might say. No, Deleuze's problem with this early period of Nietzsche is actually far deeper than this usage of a Hegel-esque opposition. The problem is Nietzsche's assertion at this time that the world even needs redeeming or justifying. Nietzsche's famous saying from The Birth of Tragedy, that it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that life can be justified, is actually the biggest problem with the work. Deleuze argues that Nietzsche himself would later see this. As Nietzsche begins to grasp the true essence of the tragic, he comes to understand that this standpoint of asking how it is that the world is to be redeemed supposes that the world is, as it stands now, condemned in some way. It's to place an element of sin upon the world. The flaw of Nietzsche's thinking at this time is an element which is less Hegelian than it is Schopenhauerian. It is that the world is an unjust place, or to put it more forcefully and more amorally, that the world of phenomena can be judged from the standpoint of the suffering that occurs within it, that existence can be ascribed a value based on pleasure or pain. Deleuze writes, quote, "For a long time, the sense of existence has only been looked for by positing it as something faulty or blameworthy, something unjust which ought to be justified. A God was needed to interpret existence. It was necessary to accuse life in order to redeem it in order to justify it. Existence was evaluated, but always from the standpoint of bad conscience. This is the Christian inspiration which compromises philosophy as a whole. Hegel interprets existence from the standpoint of the unhappy consciousness, but the unhappy consciousness is only the Hegelian version of the bad conscience. Even Schopenhauer made the question of existence or justice reverberate as never before, but he found in suffering a way of denying life, and in the negation of life, the only way of justifying it." End quote. And so, it's not difficult to see the ways in which Nietzsche falls victim to this tendency in his early work. Nietzsche is, as he fully admits, enthralled by Schopenhauer when he writes The Birth of Tragedy. He says later that it's a shame that he spoiled his first book with Schopenhauerian formulations. Deleuze then quotes from The Gay Science, part 357, which is a particularly illuminating passage in Nietzsche's work, for explaining where Nietzsche himself stands in relationship to Schopenhauer and Hegel, and how they stand in relation to one another in Nietzsche's own estimation. Quote, "As a philosopher, Schopenhauer was the first admitted and inexorable atheist among us Germans. This was the background of his enmity against Hegel. The ungodliness of existence was for him something given, palpable, indisputable. As we thus reject the Christian interpretation and condemn its meaning like counterfeit, Schopenhauer's question immediately comes to us in a terrifying way. Has existence any meaning at all? It will require a few centuries before this question can even be heard completely and in its full depth. What Schopenhauer himself said in answer to this question was, forgive me, hasty, youthful, only a compromise, a way of remaining stuck in precisely those Christian, ascetic, moral perspectives in which one has renounced faith along with the faith in God." End quote. And so, Schopenhauer's opposition to Hegel, according to Nietzsche, is that Hegel sees godliness in the world as it appears, world of objects and people and events and desires, whereas Schopenhauer sees ungodliness. Both are concerned with justifying existence based on the moral judgment that's been passed against existence, but Schopenhauer argues that we ought to negate life, and not as a means of eventually affirming it in the negation, as Hegel does, but truly and completely negate it, deny one's will to live, right? And that's the only way to justify living a human life. Only the human being with his rationality is capable of denying the will to live. Schopenhauer therefore never arrives at the godly life, since he's aimed at non-existence, and he says that that is synonymous with all that has been called holy and sacred. But he still operates from that moral premise that life needs to be redeemed, that life, simply as it is a damnable thing. Deleuze draws a comparison between two of the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, whom Nietzsche himself discusses in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, and in his pre-Platonic lectures, by the way. These figures are Heraclitus and Anaximander. In these two figures, Deleuze sees a parallel between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. In Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, Nietzsche says that Anaximander argued for the position that, quote, beings must pay penance and be judged for their injustices in accordance with the ordinance of time, end quote. And what this means is all beings derive from an original being, which is the apeiron, the undistinguished, the indefinite, the undifferentiated. All individual, particular, different things steal their existence from the apeiron, and they become distinct individual things out of that very act of theft. And so as a payment for this injustice, they have to eventually be reclaimed by that original form of being. Becoming, in which struggle and strife between particular things takes place, is therefore inherently an injustice in its very existence. The settling of this debt that one owes to reality is death. Death is the restoration of justice. So difference to Anaximander is a sort of crime against the undifferentiated, and so it has to be reclaimed and made undifferentiated once again. Deleuze writes, quote, Schopenhauer is a kind of modern Anaximander. What attracts Nietzsche so much to them both, and thus explains why in The Birth of Tragedy he is still in general faithful to their interpretations? It is undoubtedly their difference from Christianity. They see existence as criminal and blameworthy, but not yet as something faulty and responsible. End quote. In contrast with Anaximander, we have Heraclitus. Heraclitus is the philosopher of becoming, and Deleuze designates this philosophy of becoming as essentially tragic. The tragic orientation to life and to philosophy is in some way defined by this association with becoming. Quote, Heraclitus is the tragic thinker. The problem of justice runs through his entire work. Heraclitus is the one for whom life is radically innocent and just. He understands existence on the basis of an instinct of play. He makes existence an aesthetic phenomenon rather than a moral or religious one. Thus, Nietzsche opposes him, point by point, to Anaximander, just as Nietzsche himself is opposed to Schopenhauer. Heraclitus denied the duality of words. Quote, he denied being itself, end quote. Moreover, he made an affirmation of becoming, end quote. Heraclitus is of central importance to understanding the sense of the tragic, as Deleuze lays it out here. Heraclitus famously retires from public life and was found by the leading men of his city playing knucklebones with the children at the temple. Heraclitus, when pressed by these good aristocratic citizens, answers, Isn't it better to do this than to participate in your civic life? Among the metaphors that he employs, Heraclitus famously uses the image of children playing on the beach to describe the innocence of existence, the innocence of becoming, a concept we discussed earlier in the season in the episode on the camel, the lion, and the child. Deleuze goes into great detail about Nietzsche's metaphors and his imagery used in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, particularly concerning the dicethrow, the game of existence, the dicethrow of one's life. Heraclitus repeatedly uses the imagery of the player, the child, the artist, these innocent, irresponsible figures who throw the dice with joy, who give themselves over to chance, and this kind of imagery is appropriated by Nietzsche. Nietzsche characterizes Heraclitus's perspective in the work Philosophy of the Tragic Age of the Greeks, quote, the struggle of the many is pure justice itself. In fact, the one is the many. End quote. Deleuze then describes Heraclitus further, quote, the player temporarily abandons himself to life and temporarily fixes his gaze upon it. The artist places himself provisionally in his work and provisionally above it. The child plays, withdraws from the game, and returns to it. In this game of becoming, the being of becoming also plays the game with itself. The aeon, time, says Heraclitus, is a child who plays at draughts. End quote. And draughts is another term for checkers, I believe. Deleuze points out that this is not a theodicy in any sense. A theodicy being, classically speaking, the name for a rebuttal to the problem of evil, which is one of the oldest projects of Christian apologetics, is to answer the problem of evil. This sense of having to redeem the world is missing here. In this metaphor, Heraclitus reflects the childlike innocence of the Greeks. Deleuze says that, quote, in comparison with Christianity, the Greeks are like children, end quote. And true enough, when we consider Anaximander, who depreciates life, who depreciates the value of being, he still does so without making being responsible. This element of moral responsibility, of one being at fault for something called sin, is a later sophistication. It's a creation of Christianity, a refinement, a perfection of the act of depreciating life. The Greeks are like children because they still see man as essentially irresponsible, and even Anaximander, who wants to depreciate life, still does it as a child does, without the mature sophistication of Christianity. He sees our existence as an injustice, but a blameless one. And it is this view of mankind that will become particularly important for Nietzsche going forward. It's something he sees even in the Greeks who accuse life, the sense of moral irresponsibility, the lack of moral condemnation of existence. As Deleuze puts it, the question that Nietzsche contemplates throughout his time as a philologist and in the years following the publication of Birth of Tragedy is just this: is existence innocent or blameworthy? This is, in some sense, Nietzsche merely restating or reformulating one of the oldest philosophical questions, revisiting ground that's been trodden 1,000 times before. And yet, once again, Nietzsche's answer is not a reconciliation or a synthesis. Nietzsche eventually recognizes that, historically speaking, one answer has definitively won over the other. That existence is blameworthy. That position triumphed with the ascendance of Christianity and the suppression of the pagan religious feeling, we might say. So, historically speaking, the debate does not go on. Life has been considered blameworthy. And that the older view that was triumphed over by Christianity, that view of life as innocent, even though it has been suppressed, it wasn't negated as part of a struggle towards a higher understanding. It was actually just that the correct answer was defeated. We might say the healthy answer was defeated. Right logic was defeated by wrong logic. The weaker argument was made stronger. The sick values conquered the healthy values. This wasn't a progression, but a degeneration. And so the description of the tragic, which is the overall topic of the first chapter of Deleuze's work, is a description of life as innocent. This means a different orientation, a different approach to the question that we posed earlier. Rather than asserting that existence needs to be justified because of the strife that occurs within it, which is a reactive approach to the question, right? Existence becomes instead the thing that justifies. Existence is not what needs to be justified. Existence is the justification. Life justifies strife. This is what affirmation means. Life is good. Life is valuable. Existence is good. Existence is valuable. This is what justifies the suffering within it. Not to ask the question from the other vantage point, the reactive vantage point, which is to say, look at all this suffering within existence. How could one possibly justify all of that? And so this is a complete transvaluation, a complete shift in one's perspective. That's the sense of the tragic, as Deleuze argues. Nietzsche understood it. The reclamation of the perspective of the innocence of existence, the embrace of irresponsibility, and the sense of existence as itself a justification rather than needing a justification. Life is a tragedy and life is good. And so one of the main topics that Deleuze covers in this chapter on the tragic is the dicethrow, and in an esoteric and at times obtuse series of passages in which Deleuze might be said to give Hegel a run for his money in terms of how contrived some of the phraseology is. Nevertheless, Deleuze's argument on the sense of the dicethrow is that the metaphor of the dicethrow unifies chance and necessity in the Nietzschean affirmation of life. Deleuze says that only bad players would consider the eventual rolling of the winning number as an inevitability from casting the dice multiple times. That kind of attitude correlates with the kind of interpretations of the eternal return which attempt to argue that the idea of eternal return is, it's assured given the conservation of matter, the conservation of energy, given an infinite amount of time. It's assured that every single state of matter, every single arrangement of matter, every event or series of events would happen an infinite number of times in the same sequence in the same fashion. Deleuze wants to shake us out of that kind of positivistic reading of the eternal return. His assertion is that only the winning number, which in this metaphor would be double sixes, only this reproduces the dice throw and returns us to cast the dice again, to play the game once again. In other words, it's not a matter of trusting in an infinite repetition or an infinite number of times. We might say getting an infinite number of chances. Deleuze says that this kind of faith in an infinite number of chances is playing the game of life badly. The real significance of Deleuze's focus on the dice throw in Nietzsche's thought is to oppose any attempt to conflate Nietzsche's fatalism with the faith of the Christians. It's not the ability to trust in fate because of a belief in an enduring moral or metaphysical principle that we call eternal return, or something of the like. Instead, the one who plays the game of life well throws the dice without a care, without an expectation of getting multiple tries at the game. And that's what it means to really embrace chance. And it's the recognition that chance is one and the same with necessity, because what is chance other than necessity, which has not yet been revealed to us? Chance is the necessity of that which we are ignorant. And so to embrace chance is to live in necessity, in affirmation of necessity. And it's that way that one affirms becoming, but you don't do this through faith in the eternal return as if you're getting an infinite number of chances at life. That's playing the game badly. And the way that unity is affirmed in multiplicity, as Heraclitus says, the many is the one affirms the being of becoming by the same token. As Nietzsche writes in his notes, perhaps the highest pursuit of the will to power would be to stamp becoming with the character of being, and thus to say, chaos is the rule, change is eternal, becoming is being. A double affirmation, therefore, an affirmation of becoming and an affirmation of being in becoming, or to extend the metaphor of the dice throw, double sixes, a winning roll. There's a wonderful passage in the final section of the first chapter in which Deleuze contrasts this approach of Nietzsche, his trusting fatalism, with the approach of Blaise Pascal and Pascal's wager. Deleuze argues, quote, "From Pascal to Kierkegaard, one bets and then leaps. But these are not the exercises of Dionysus or Zarathustra. Leaping is not dancing, and betting is not playing. It will be noted how Zarathustra, without preconceptions, opposes playing to betting and dancing to leaping. It is the bad player who bets, and above all, it is the buffoon who leaps, who thinks that leaping means dancing, overcoming, going beyond. If we mention Pascal's wager, it is merely to conclude finally that it has nothing in common with the dice throw. In the wager, it is not at all a matter of affirming chance, the whole of chance, but on the contrary of fragmenting it into probabilities, of minting it into chances of gain and loss. This is why it is pointless to wonder whether the wager really has a theological sense or whether it is only apologetic. For Pascal's wager is not concerned with the existence or non-existence of God. The wager is anthropological. It merely concerns two modes of existence of man, the existence of the man who says that God exists and the existence of the man who says that God does not exist. The existence of God not being put into play in the wager is, nevertheless, the perspective presupposed by it, the standpoint according to which chance is fragmented into chances of winning and losing. The whole alternative is governed by the ascetic ideal and the depreciation of life. Nietzsche is right to oppose his own game to Pascal's wager." End quote. Deleuze thus concludes this exegesis of the tragic with what he calls the touchstone, the test for whether one has understood Nietzsche or not. He says that we should not ask whether someone thinks the same things Nietzsche thinks. We should rather ask to what degree we perceive resentment and bad conscience within their thought. Again, Nietzsche teaches us to ask which one, who is speaking. To what extent does this person allow his thought to be guided by the spirit of revenge, which is the root of the Christian form of reasoning about the world, and that condemns life from the perspective of the slave, the perspective of one who is dominated and reactive. Deleuze argues that naturally, Nietzsche's dichotomy of Apollo and Dionysus, which appears in his first work, could not remain as his central orienting idea. But the genealogical roots of Nietzsche's later tragic philosophy is found in Birth of Tragedy, in spite of its flaws. Here we have the first inkling of Nietzsche's real struggle. Apollo and Dionysus is not the only dichotomy presented in the book. There's also the dichotomy between the theoretic and the tragic. In Birth of Tragedy, the avatar for the theoretical worldview is Socrates, the dialectician, the plebeian, the ugly man who accuses society and displays an incisive skepticism towards their inherited and irrational beliefs. But as Deleuze argues, Socrates cannot really be the final enemy of Nietzsche's philosophical project either. He is, in some sense, too Apollonian. Socrates is still concerned with the Delphic god's admonition, know thyself. His mind, like Apollo, draws the boundary lines of distinction and difference through the use of reason. And while he's in prison, destined to die, he receives a vision from Apollo. Socrates, practice music. And so the logician who had always treated music as a dangerous force in society composes some hymns and paeans to Apollo out of devotion and duty to that god. He's also too Dionysian, even as he disrupts the interplay of art forces by attacking the Dionysian and seeking to illegitimize the arts and poetry and drama. Nietzsche writes that perhaps Socrates' great irony was the artistic power that he had, the creativity behind his creation of a new world orientation, a new world feeling. There's a sense in which Socrates simply gave himself up to the artistic instincts driving him and let his ego yield to the demands of his daemon. Socrates, as the theoretical man par excellence, is not unlike Anaximander in the respect that he also finds fault with what is. And perhaps he's even a further step down this path because he introduces an element of moral responsibility. But Socrates is perhaps too positive in his vision of life in comparison to the Christian vision. His philosophy is still geared towards the good life, which is possible on this earth. He dares to imagine an ideal earthly society. Socrates is still too Greek. Deleuze writes, quote, Socrates does not give the negation of life its full force. The negation of life has not yet found its essence. End quote. Further down, Deleuze continues, quote, for the Dionysus-Socrates opposition is substituted the true opposition. Quote, have I been understood? Dionysus versus the crucified. End quote. And that last line is, of course, a refrain found towards the end of Ecce Homo, indicating that the final dichotomy that Nietzsche arrives at is not the theoretic versus the tragic, which is found in the same book as the provisional form Apollo and Dionysus, but even the theoretic versus the tragic is only provisional. The final dichotomy is the Christian versus the tragic. The triumph of Christianity was the triumph of a worldview which judges existence for the suffering within it, makes existence responsible for the suffering contained within it, and finally redeems life by means of the afterlife. And what is truly tragic for Nietzsche is that that type of valuation is what succeeded. One of Zarathustra's darkest thoughts is that this type of valuation always succeeds. This is something that Deleuze explores at great length, that one's conclusions after studying the whole of world history and human psychology is that what is Christian always seems to overthrow the tragic. Now, of course, there's another side to this. Much of the final chapter of Nietzsche and Philosophy concerns Deleuze's interpretation that in the final analysis, that which is reactive does not return, that the eternal return only indicates the return of difference, the return of the affirmative and the active. But we'll get into that a bit later. To use the dice throw metaphor again, only the winning number brings back the dice throw. So there is hope. But nevertheless, again, Nietzsche thinks that the Christian orientation towards life, the idea that life is blameworthy, has definitively triumphed, that this was not a progression, and that it triumphed over something that was good or better or healthier, we might say. What I want to focus on now is Deleuze's discussion of Nietzsche's typology. This is important because typology is, in its very essence, pluralistic instead of dialectical. Again, the key question underlying so many of Nietzsche's inquiries is which one? This must be understood as a genealogical approach to philosophy, which is to understand the value of origins, and thus to look to the origin of what one values. And genealogy, I guess, has both of those senses to it. Deleuze has a nice turn of phrase that what is genealogical is concerned with the value of origin and the origin of values. It's concerned with both. In any case, when it comes to Nietzsche's typology, we wouldn't expect to find types or classes of philosophers that exist as neatly balanced antitheses, or whatever one would expect when approaching philosophy dialectically. Instead, Nietzsche's typology presents a multiplicity of different types, each of which has to be understood in their own terms, in their own genealogical context. Deleuze writes in the third section of the fourth chapter, entitled Typology of Ressentiment, quote, "A type is a reality which is simultaneously biological, psychical, historical, social, and political," end quote. In other words, Nietzsche's typology, according to Deleuze, includes everything. That's why it may be sometimes hard to pin down exactly how to categorize some of Nietzsche's arguments. It's why there are so many different interpretations of his work also, or it's one reason. Because one person might emphasize the moral aspect, another, Nietzsche's psychological aspect, or Nietzsche's aesthetic aspects, and we might be left wondering, which is the most relevant. And Deleuze would say, rhizomatically speaking, all of it. The very touchstone by which Deleuze says we can know whether someone understands Nietzsche, which, to recap, is, quote, "To what extent is there bad conscience and ressentiment in his thought," end quote. This is a typological question. We're asking which one is speaking in this way, and the approach necessitates the incorporation of all of those elements: biological, physiological, psychological, social, political, ethical. We include all of that in the inquiry, which one, because without all of it, one has an incomplete answer. To understand thought genealogically requires that one ask this question and answer it thoroughly. This is what is implied by a conception of difference as this active uniqueness that doesn't exist as a mere refutation or relation, but as its own being, which enjoys its difference from other beings. What we're describing here is existence in active terms. Obviously, existence has other aspects, or else we wouldn't even have a concept of something called reactivity or resentment or slave morality if existence didn't have reactive aspects to it. But this leads into Deleuze's explanation of the difference between active and reactive forces. Deleuze says, quote, "There are nothing but quantities of force and mutual, quote, relations of tension," end quote. "Every force is related to others, and it either obeys or commands. What defines a body is this relation between dominant and dominated forces. Every relationship of forces constitutes a body, whether it is chemical, biological, social, or political. Any two forces, being unequal, constitute a body as soon as they enter into a relationship. This is why the body is always the fruit of chance in the Nietzschean sense, and appears as the most astonishing thing, much more astonishing, in fact, than consciousness and spirit. But chance, the relation of force with force, is also the essence of force. The birth of a living body is not therefore surprising, since every body is living. being the arbitrary product of forces of which it is composed. Being composed of a plurality of irreducible forces, the body is a multiple phenomenon. Its unity is that of a multiple phenomenon, a, quote, unity of domination, end quote. In a body, the superior or dominant forces are known as active, and the inferior or dominated forces are known as reactive, end quote. So, this is why Nietzsche's typology is so far-reaching, because what can be called a body could be a physical body or a national body, any relation of forces based on command and obedience. Once again, Deleuze would insist this is not a dialectical relationship. The constituent forces don't gain their identity out of this relationship, and the relation is not essentially negative. The forces don't seek to negate each other. The relations of command and obedience don't presuppose this. It's an affirmative relationship. Most useful for following the argument past this point, I think, would be to consider this on the level of the human body, the body in the physiological sense. This has remarkable consequences for our understanding of psychology. For Nietzsche, as Deleuze points out, consciousness itself is a reactive phenomenon, not an active one. Why is this? Well, Deleuze argues, quote, consciousness merely expresses the relation of certain reactive forces in the active forces which dominate them. Consciousness is essentially reactive, end quote. And the way in which consciousness expresses relations of reactive forces is the way in which Nietzsche argues that reason is merely a mediating force, something to be used or drawn upon by the true masters of the body, one's drives or impulses. Consciousness exists, therefore, in an inferior relationship to forces which are unknown, or which we are unconscious of. And Deleuze quotes from Nietzsche's unpublished notes in The Will to Power, quote, the great activity is unconscious, end quote. Deleuze also cites this passage from the second chapter of Genealogy of Morality, quote, one overlooks the essential priority of the spontaneous, aggressive, expansive, form-giving forces that give new interpretations and directions, although adaptation follows only after this. The dominant role of the highest functionaries within the organism itself is denied. End quote. So, consciousness is essentially reactive in its function because it serves the purposes of reactive forces, whilst that which is active in the body, that which truly dominates, remains unknown, because by the nature of these active forces they escape conscious awareness. Deleuze will argue that in this healthy relationship between dominating and obeying forces, the reactive forces are acted. What this means is, I think, explained very well by his remarks in Chapter 2, quote, obedience is a quality of force as such and relates to power just as much as commanding does, end quote. And then Deleuze quotes Nietzsche from the notes collected in Will to Power, quote, individual power is by no means surrendered. In the same way, there is in commanding an admission that the absolute power of the opponent has not been vanquished, incorporated, disintegrated. Obedience and commanding are forms of struggle, end quote. So, when active forces are in the commanding role, the reactive forces lose none of their power or their identity. They continue to exist in their difference, albeit in an inferior role, but one in which their reactive power is acted, quote, by fulfilling the conditions of life and the functions and tasks of conservation, adaptation, and utility. This is the point of departure for a concept whose importance in Nietzsche will be seen below the concept of reaction, the mechanical and utilitarian accommodations, the regulations which express all the power of inferior and dominated forces. We always think we have done enough when we understand an organism in terms of reactive forces. The nature of reactive forces and their quivering fascinates us, end quote. And so Deleuze argues, science tends to understand us only through the lens of the reactive forces. Science steeps itself in the biases inherent to conscious rational thought, which is to say, by its very nature, reactive thought. Deleuze continues, quote, "Science follows the paths of consciousness, relying entirely on other reactive forces. The organism is always seen from the petty side, from the side of its reactions." End quote. So think of, for example, the stimulus and response theory of the organism. It's a presentation of many of Nietzsche's ideas that I've often used because I find it persuasive within the habits of our conscious thought, right? But stimulus and response theory makes the organism reactive. To think of it as merely responding, as though life were an essentially passive thing that acts only when it receives a prodding from the outside. And so perhaps the origin of this reactive perspective can be found in consciousness itself. We might ask, what is conscious self-reflection other than a record of past sense impressions? A memory of what was in your conscious experience, which is to say, a cataloging of past sense data, of past forces that acted on you, that produced an experience which you now remember, an imprint. Consciousness is, in some sense, a history of your past reactions. Consciousness is valuable from an evolutionary standpoint because it gives us this very capacity for reaction. It gives us the capacity for reflection. Reflection's a type of reaction, in fact. We engage in reflection on our lives, our actions, our successes, or our failures, and it's valuable insofar as we're failing to generate successful outcomes simply by following our instincts. Our drives or instincts or impulses, these enter into our conscious experience as the influence of active forces, but when impulse just produces the winning result on its own, conscious reflection is not necessary. The advantage of consciousness is the awareness of failure. In other words, awareness of the failure of one's activity offers that possibility to redirect your efforts. Consciousness is, it seems, useful to the species, but in this reactive role. It's useful when it is subordinate to the active forces that govern the body. Deleuze then quotes from Will to Power again, a very significant quote from Nietzsche on this. Quote, "This entire phenomenon of the body is, from the intellectual point of view, as superior to our consciousness, to our spirit, to our conscious way of thinking, feeling, and willing, as algebra is to the multiplication table." End quote. So, algebra here, what's meant is that's the reality of the power of mathematics versus the multiplication table, which is only a system of signs or symbols. It's a representation which is useful for conveying the power of mathematics, for understanding it, and most importantly, for representing it. Representation is reactive since it's a post hoc construction. The comprehension gained based on a conceptual rendering, based on sense perceptions. These very sense perceptions being our reactions to external active forces. And so we could say that the consciousness is the reactive reflection of the body. The conscious intellect always has this tendency to identify with reactive forces for that very reason. Deleuze believes that this is responsible for the current image of thought which we hold, which is related with what we might call truth-seeking, which makes truth an element of thought. Deleuze thinks that this is inherently reactive, that it expresses our dogmatism and it denies perspective. Deleuze writes, quote, "Truth as a concept is entirely undetermined. Everything we think depends on the value and sense of what we think. We always have the truths we deserve as a function of the sense of what we conceive, of the value of what we believe. Any thinkable or thought sense is only brought into effect insofar as the forces that correspond to it in thought also take hold of something, appropriate something outside thought. Clearly, thought cannot think by itself any more than it can find truth by itself." End quote. And Deleuze goes on to argue that a quote-unquote fount of truth is a completely absurd concept because in reality we only ever find particular truths. Once again, we've done away with the idea of immaculate perception. We understand perception as a taking hold of, and understand that from our given perspective, we're going to take hold of a given event according to who and what we are and invest it with the sense that it has based on its meaning for us from our vantage point and given our desires, given our values. And so we don't find truth in the abstract. That concept is somewhat meaningless. And so Deleuze argues that Nietzsche gives us a new image of thought. Quote, "Truth is not the element of thought. The element of thought is sense and value." End quote. And further down in the same passage, Deleuze continues, quote, "Thinking is never the exercise of a faculty. Thought never thinks alone and by itself. Moreover, it is never simply disturbed by forces which remain external to it. Thinking depends on forces which take hold of thought. Insofar as our thinking is controlled by reactive forces, insofar as it finds its sense in reactive forces, we must admit that we are not yet thinking. Thinking means the activity of thought, but thought has its own ways of being inactive, which can occupy it and all its forces entirely. The fictions through which reactive forces triumph are the most base element in thought, the way in which it remains inactive and busies itself with not thinking. When Heidegger declares, 'We are not yet thinking,' one origin of this theme is Nietzsche." End quote. So to conceive of thought as a faculty is an essentialized picture of thought. And we might note that that's the route that Kant takes when he's explaining a priori synthetic judgments, that we make these judgments by virtue of a faculty. Nietzsche disagrees. Thinking is not an activity that occurs alone, but represents the operation of differing forces. Thought is seized by forces, the multiple drives within us. And so Nietzsche has a notion of what thinking might be when it is seized not by reactive forces, but by active ones. Thinking as an activity and an affirmation. Thinking as a truly creative deed. But because all we know seems to be characterized by reactive forces seizing our thought, what we call thinking is not really thinking in this creative or independent manner. Thinking is always an activity and operation carried out on behalf of the force that has appropriated it, and because reactive forces are dominant, our thought is reactive. For Deleuze, the whole history of scholarship and the sciences, and all of philosophy is, for the most part, reactive. Deleuze has a great passage back in the second chapter on active and reactive, in which he elaborates on the Nietzschean critique of science, and he explains why the Nietzschean problem of science goes well beyond a problem with what we might call scientism or positivism, but rather becomes a critique of science as a discipline. And I'm quoting here in abridged form, quote, "Nietzsche believes that science, and the way it handles quantities, always tends to equalize them, to make up for inequalities. Nietzsche, as a critic of science, never invokes the rights of quality against quantity. He invokes the rights of difference in quantity against equality, of inequality against equalization of quantities. Nietzsche imagines a numerical and quantitative scale, but one in which the divisions are not multiples or factors of one another. What he attacks in science is precisely the scientific mania for seeking balances, the utilitarianism and egalitarianism proper to science. What is the significance of this tendency to reduce quantitative differences? In the first place, it expresses the way in which science is a part of the nihilism of modern thought. The attempt to deny differences is a part of the more general enterprise of denying life, depreciating existence, and promising it a death, heat or otherwise, where the universe sinks into the undifferentiated. Nietzsche accuses the conceptions of matter, weight, and heat of being, in the final analysis, agents of an equalization of quantities, principles of an adiaphoria. It is in this sense that Nietzsche shows that science is part of the aesthetic ideal and serves it in its own way. But we must also look for the instrument of nihilistic thought in science. The answer is that science by inclination understands phenomena in terms of reactive forces and interprets them from this standpoint. Physics is reactive in the same way as biology. Things are always seen from the petty side, the side of reactions." End quote. So science is based on adiaphoria, which means, in physiological terms, the refusal or acquired inability to respond to a repeated stimulus. In terms of Stoicism and other forms of ascetic practice, adiaphoria is the indifference to changes and impermanence in life, indifference to the deviations from one's normal experience. It's what Buddhists call equanimity, so it's a virtue in some Stoic traditions, right? The term adiaphoria literally means without difference or undifferentiated, and this is the sense in which science is an adiaphoria. The comments about science promising the heat death of the universe and the return to the undifferentiated state shows, for Deleuze, how conscious thought tends toward this desire for equalization. It's like the suggestion of Anaximander that all distinct forms of life have to return to the aperon. This occurs as well in the attempts to represent the universe in terms of balanced, sensible quantities. There is a neatness, a cleanliness about it, a settling of all imperfections. And in reactive thought, inequality, difference is an imperfection. This ties into the way that Deleuze interprets the eternal return, which I do have to say I have some issues with, but I'm going to save my own opinion for later episodes. Deleuze draws on one of the arguments that Nietzsche makes in his notebooks, which we've already discussed in the episodes on eternal return, that if the universe had some sort of final state or a goal, then why hasn't the universe reached this goal? Assuming that time couldn't have ever, quote-unquote, began, because to say so is to commit ourselves to an absurd premise, then an infinite amount of time exists before and after the present moment. If there were any final state of matter, matter would be in this final state and would never deviate from it. What Deleuze argues, therefore, is that the eternal return is the Nietzschean conception of time, and it rejects this kind of mechanistically based finitude of differentiated existence. Deleuze argues Nietzsche's position is not cyclical either, though. He says that we don't find the prefiguration of Nietzsche's views in the pre-Socratics, maybe with the possible exception of Heraclitus. Deleuze writes, quote, "We misinterpret the expression eternal return if we understand it as the return of the same. It is not being that returns, but rather the returning itself that constitutes being, insofar as it is affirmed of becoming and of that which passes. It is not some one thing which returns, but rather returning itself is the one thing which is affirmed of diversity and multiplicity." End quote. So, for Deleuze, the significance of Zarathustra as the prophet of eternal return is not that he argued for the eternality of the same, but that he argued for the eternality of difference, that the mechanistic settling of accounts, or return of the undifferentiated, is yet another reactive attempt to get away from difference, which is the basis of true activity and affirmation. For Deleuze, this is the meaning of Nietzsche's argument that to stamp becoming with the character of being is that highest pursuit of the will to power. In effect, the eternal return, the ring of return, the circuit of eternal return, is the eternality of difference, or to speak with the vulgar, the principle that change is eternal. There is a wonderful passage in this third chapter called Origin in the Inverted Image, which I'd like to read from at length. And it's Deleuze's account of how the noble or active forces and the inferior or reactive forces perceive one another. This is the perspective of two different types, each with their own sense, and thus clashing values. Again, for Deleuze, the focus is metaphysics, and we're in a section of the work focusing on Nietzsche's typology, which means that these statements can be applied on many different levels. So Deleuze argues in the first paragraph of this section, quote, "In the beginning, at the origin, there is the difference between active and reactive forces. Action and reaction are not in a relation of succession, but in one of coexistence in the origin itself. Only active force asserts itself, it affirms its difference and makes its difference an object of enjoyment and affirmation. Reactive force, even when it obeys, limits active force, imposes limitations and partial restrictions on it, and is already controlled by the spirit of the negative. This is why the origin itself, in one sense, includes an inverted self-image, seen from the side of reactive forces. The differential and genealogical element appears upside down. Difference has become negation. Affirmation has become contradiction. An inverted image of the origin accompanies the origin. Yes, from the point of view of active forces, becomes no from the point of view of reactive forces, and affirmation of the self becomes negation of the other. This is what Nietzsche calls the quote-unquote inversion of the value-positing I. Active forces are noble, but they find themselves before a plebeian image, reflected in reactive forces. Genealogy is the art of difference or distinction, the art of nobility, but it sees itself upside down in the mirror of reactive forces. Its image then appears as that of evolution. Sometimes this evolution is understood in the German manner, as a dialectical and Hegelian evolution, as the development of contradiction. Sometimes it is understood in the English manner, as a utilitarian derivation and the development of profit and interest. But true genealogy is always caricatured in the essentially reactive image that evolution presents of it. Thus, it is characteristic of reactive forces to deny, from the start, the difference which constitutes them at the start, to invert the differential element from which they derive, and to give a deformed image of it. Quote, difference breeds hatred, Beyond Good and Evil 263. This is why they do not see themselves as forces and prefer to turn against themselves, rather than seeing themselves in this way and accepting difference. The mediocrity of thought, which Nietzsche attacks, always reflects a mania for interpreting and evaluating phenomena in terms of reactive forces. Every nation chooses its own, but this mania has its origins at the beginning, in the inverted image. End quote. And so this relates back to Deleuze's comments that we considered at the beginning of the episode, that the entire Hegelian dialectic is from the perspective of the slave, because it's a reactive perspective. Deleuze says, this difference in what image is formed is not some imbalance that can be settled, some disturbance to an original harmony. It's right there at the origin. There's no presupposed unity between forces. In fact, Deleuze says at one point, quote, inseparable does not mean identical, end quote, insisting that even forces which we might call codependent are not part of some underlying unity or equality, but remain different. They remain their own thing. The perception of the active from the perspective of the reactive is something essential to the difference of reactive forces. Their difference that sets them apart from what is active. This is not the kind of thing that can be resolved in a synthesis. It's a difference that's core to the genealogy of these two modes of being. Or we might say modes of becoming, if we want to be cute about it. Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche centers this insight. The perception of the active from the perspective of the reactive is the perspective of religion, particularly the Christian religion that dominated Western thought. It's the perspective of science, including modern mechanistic models of the universe. It even characterizes our aesthetics, our common sense opinions, our personal perspectives and moral views. This is what Deleuze calls the triumph of reactive forces. It is the role of the reactive to set limits, to intercede, to regulate. The reactive operates in this way whenever it's subordinated to an active force in what we might call a healthy relationship. It serves this function as a way to facilitate action. But when the reactive forces triumph, Deleuze insists that they do not comprise a greater force than that of the active. The reactive does not win by overcoming the active, as it were, by force. The reactive does not become active merely in the act of triumphing. A key part of Nietzsche's critique of morality as seen in his genealogy is that the person with the slave morality can be the winner, and in fact have been the winners, and can be the person calling the shots, that the slave does not become the master simply by triumphing. The people with the master morality, in fact, tend to lose, as we mentioned earlier, because they put less stock in things like self-preservation or moderation or prudence, these reactive qualities that characterize the reactive consciousness. It's not by the mere fact of your placement in the power structure that you actually become a master or slave. That, in fact, in Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche, that actually has nothing to do with it. That this type of judgment or this type of valuation has a life of its own, beyond the, concrete historical instantiations of it. And so how is it that the reactive forces, quote unquote, win? What is it that characterizes the victory of the reactive? Well, it's that they separate the active force from what it can do. From Nietzsche's perspective, the idea of separating a force from what it can do is a sort of inherent contradiction in a way, because the force is what it can do. This is the essentially reactive nature of all the philosophical doctrines based on being. They all commit this reaction of distilling a thingness from forces, some kind of neutral substance or substrate, whether we call it a soul or matter, and reify people, animals, objects, and events into beings. This is a point that Nietzsche makes about grammar rather extensively in the genealogy, and we've brought this up numerous times in the podcast, but Nietzsche says we make this mistake when we say the lightning flashes, the bell rang, the predator preyed. But the lightning is the flash in terms of what it can do, right? The bell is the ringing. The predator is only a predator because it preys. In other words, the designation predator is a post hoc categorization, something that exists conceptually for classifying the thing according to what it does. Once we've made this categorization, the essentially reactive reflection of reality, the reactive force proceeds by investing this reflection, this representation, with substance, treating what it does as something that the essence of the force, quote unquote, can either choose to do or can choose not to do. For Nietzsche, this is a mistake because, again, what the force can do is what it really is. This fiction, this falsification of the world, is the means that the reactive forces use to separate active forces from their activity. And this is the explanation for why, if everything is will to power, that which is weak tends to triumph. It's because they're able to separate the active forces from what they can do without ever having to comprise a greater or stronger force. And this is the meaning of that great slave revolt in morality that Nietzsche writes of in the genealogy. The domination of the body by conscious rationality and its moral fictions. And for Deleuze, this reactivity constitutes virtually all of human history, as we would call it. All we have to indicate that there was ever anything else is the vague notion that mankind once had a prehistory in which a more normal or healthy relationship existed between active and reactive. And we have the hope, that is presented by Nietzsche that the same might become true once again, perhaps in the future. That's what Nietzsche looks forward to. But the whole history of civilization, our religions, our arts and sciences, the record is rather dismal. And Deleuze writes the following, quote, "Active forces become reactive, and the word becoming must be taken in the strongest sense. The becoming of forces appears as a becoming reactive. Are there no other ways of becoming? The fact remains that we do not feel, experience, or know any becoming but becoming reactive. We are not merely noting the existence of reactive forces, we are noting the fact that everywhere they are triumphant. How do they triumph? Through the will to nothingness, thanks to the affinity between reaction and negation. What is negation? It is a quality of the will to power, the one which qualifies it as nihilism or will to nothingness, the one which constitutes the becoming reactive of forces. It must not be said that active force becomes reactive because reactive forces triumph. On the contrary, they triumph because, by separating active force from what it can do, they betray themselves to nothingness, to a becoming reactive deeper than themselves. This is why the figures of the triumph of reactive forces, ressentiment, bad conscience, and the ascetic ideal, are primarily forms of nihilism. The becoming reactive The becoming nihilistic of force seems to be the essential components of the relation of force with force. Is there another becoming? Everything tempts us to think that perhaps there is. But as Nietzsche often says, we would need another sensibility, another way of feeling. We cannot yet reply to this question. We can hardly even contemplate its possibility. But we can ask why we only feel and know a becoming reactive. Because becoming reactive is constitutive of man? Ressentiment, bad conscience, and nihilism are not psychological traits, but the foundation of humanity and man. They are the principle of man as such. Man, skin disease of the earth, reaction of the earth. It is in this sense that Zarathustra speaks of his great contempt for man and of his great danger. Another sensibility, another becoming. Would they still be man's? End quote. So here we have, I think, a wonderful exegesis of the meaning of Zarathustra's great contempt. The reason why he loves man is because man is a bridge and not a goal, and his enticement, therefore, for all of us to go under. That man as he is now is a laughingstock and an embarrassment because man is the reactive animal. Reactivity characterizes us as organisms, perhaps because of our existence as the conscious, rational animal. But whatever the cause, it seems to have always been this way. Reactivity is all we have known, because activity, the great activity, remains unknown and unconscious. It may even be the essence of what it means to be human, such that we can't even really imagine what it would be like to be an active type of human being. What would man as an active humanity look like? Could we still call him man? Or would we have to call him something beyond or above or over man? This is why Nietzsche often links both prehistory and a kind of suprahistorical existence. Why his eye is fixed on both that which was before the age of morality, which we could also call the age of reactivity, but also on what comes after it, the possibility for an active affirmative existence. But from this reactive perspective, we can't even really imagine what it would be, because becoming, the world as it appears, is a becoming reactive. Becoming itself is stamped with the character of reaction. And that's our metaphysics, a world of objects, of dead states, in which the thing is separate from what it does. Our doctrines of free will, of moral responsibility, are all further symptoms of this. And that is one of the great insights of Nietzsche that I think Deleuze zeroes in upon, that free will, exists for the purposes of making mankind blameworthy. We're not blameworthy because we have free will, and that's a fact. We ask which one is speaking, who wants to saddle mankind with this moral responsibility and make existence blameworthy. That's the one who will come up with the doctrine of free will, right? So is there a becoming active? That's the question that Deleuze poses here. And we could see the overall thrust of Nietzsche's affirmative philosophy, therefore, as addressing itself essentially to this question alone. How does man cease in becoming reactive and become active? And then what is the active man, the affirming man, the one who justifies suffering because of existence, rather than asking how existence can be justified in all its suffering? What is the path to this kind of affirmative life? And what is the process by which a force that has been separated from what it can do becomes active again? In other words, how do we stop being a thing and become a force once again? We're going to talk about all of that next week. And it's very exciting because next week we'll get to go over some of the concepts that we've touched upon earlier this season, such as forgetting, the camel, the lion, and the child metamorphoses, because Deleuze discusses these ideas, and we're then going to look at them through the lens that Deleuze offers us. We'll conclude this week's outing then by noting that Deleuze sees Nietzsche's concept of the overman as the image of mankind with a new kind of sensibility, a new kind of feeling about life, an affirmative feeling. This is the sensibility of the player of the game of life, the player who casts the dice throw. Nietzsche's other metaphors include, the dancer or the artist or the creator or the self-legislator. Again, it is the language of play and innocence and creativity over dialectical responsibilities, duties and obligations, all of the sort of past gloominess of philosophy, which constitutes the spirit of gravity. Perhaps the most profound insight that Deleuze offers us, I think, is also the most simple of his insights. That the real reason why Nietzsche is against the dialectic is quite simply that, unlike the dialecticians, the fruit of the argument is not a synthesis of opposites, not a return to an original unity. Nietzsche takes sides in the conflict. Beyond good and evil does not mean beyond good and bad. And the good for Nietzsche is, in Deleuze's estimation, synonymous with the active when it is allowed to act. The good is even the reactive when its reactions are acted as part of a healthy body. The bad is the triumph of the reactive, the inversion of the relation of forces, the separation of action from being. And Deleuze insists upon Nietzsche as a philosopher of activity and of chance and of difference, multiplicity rather than duality, particularity rather than opposition, genealogy rather than mutual interdependence. Nietzsche is a modern Heraclitus who is point by point opposed to Schopenhauer, the modern Anaximander, and Nietzsche is above all the supreme pluralist and the tragic philosopher, and thus the most ferocious opponent of the Hegelian and the Christian. As Deleuze argues in his introduction to the English translation of his work, quote, Nietzsche snatches thought from the element of truth and falsity. He turns it into an interpretation and an evaluation, interpretation of forces, evaluation of power. It is a thought movement, not merely in the sense that Nietzsche wants to reconcile thought and concrete movement, but in the sense that thought itself must produce movements, bursts of extraordinary speed and slowness. As a result, philosophy has a new relationship with the arts of movement, theater, dance, and music. End quote. If I may say so, that is as wonderful a summary of Nietzsche's work as any I've read. So kudos to Deleuze for that one. Join me next week for part 2 of our analysis of Nietzsche and Philosophy by Deleuze, where we will discuss ressentiment, bad conscience, nihilism, and what is on the other side of all of those things, becoming active. See you next time, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.